Hello everyone and welcome to Ninip Goes Interactive. In this presentation, we will show you the new exciting features that we added in Namib in the last year. Especially the interactivity features of which we are very excited about. Why am I saying we? Because Hugo is here and he's actually the mastermind behind most of the great features that got into Namib in the last year. Thanks, Hugo.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So, I'm Pietro. I'm from Milano, Italy. And as a day job, I work as a data scientist in supply chain planning software, whatever that is. I did speak about Namib also last year, and I helped organize the Nim Dev Room in February this year. I had a lot of fun, and so I think I will want to help organize also the 2023 FOSDEM, which will be in person, so it would be a very nice opportunity to meet people there.
Yes, and my name is Hugo Grandstrom. I'm from Sweden, and I'm studying engineering physics. I'm on my last year now. And since July this year, I have had the great honor of being a maintainer alongside Pietro. So I'm really grateful for that. And I have created a nimib theme, Nim slides, which you can create slideshows with in Nim. And I'm doing a talk now at NimConf about that as well. So you can check it out as well if you like this. And I'm also a member of Signin, a collection of people who promote scientific computing in Nim, among other things. And we develop a few libraries. And my most notable library is numerical Nim, which lets you do numerical methods like integrating interpolation or solving ODEs. And I also help start Signame's Getting Started page, which is some tutorials on how to use the libraries in Signame. And it uses nimib, which is another nimib theme, which is based on MDBook.
Thanks, Hugo. So, as a reminder, the last year presentation is still valid and available, but this year we will make a very short introduction for people who don't know what Namib is. Then we will talk about the latest release, 0.3, called Block Maker, since one of the feature is a big refactoring of the main piece of Namib, which is the NB block, the block of code. And this allows you to make your own NB block and customize and invent a lot of stuff. And that's also how Hugo created all the blocks that add the interactivities, which is a feature I am really happy about it. I was just so happy when it was merged. So Hugo will present with that part, and he will also present NimiBoost, a VS Codium extension he has been working on, which adds some goodies to Namib development workflow. Then we will be back together again to talk about contributing to Namib and the roadmap. And now, a short video introduction to Namib for beginners.
Hi everyone, I'm Pietro, and today I will show you how the nimib library allows you to create HTML documents directly from Nim code. With nimib, you can share your Nim adventures and help Nim fulfill its destiny and become the one language to rule them all. I want to play with a cool library that was released recently called QRGen by Aruseta. I have already installed the library, and I'm typing the first example that comes in QRGen's README. Let my QR equals new QR, and the content is a mysterious URL. Okay, let's compile and run. nimrqrfun. Oh, muy chula Rosetta. A nice QR code in terminal ASCII codes. Very nice. So this is a very simple piece of code that does something and prints output to terminal. And now I will show you how using nimib we can capture the code and the output and produce an HTML document that shows both. I need to import nimib, which I have already installed, initialize a nimib document, and wrap my code in an mbcode command. Finally, with nbsave, I will ask nimib to render the HTML and save it to file. And now, with the same command, but I add the nbshow runtime option. Here you go. The HTML has been produced, and thanks to the nbshow option, a browser tab has been automatically opened, showing me the QR code and my code. So if you're trying to find out the URL using your phone, this might not just work for you. We need another step. Let's try to print an image, because the terminal ASCII stuff, I don't know, with my phone it doesn't work. With yours it might. But let's just show how to actually print an image and show it. I'll just keep the code here and write an image file, since QRGen has a nice option to print to SVG. And I want to visualize this same SVG file. Before rendering the HTML, let me show you one last piece of nimib command, the nbtext, which is just what it says. A block that allows me to write some markdown text and have it rendered to HTML. Where will the mysterious URL lead me? And standard markdown, it's a good idea to add a link to the library I'm playing with. Let me copy and paste the URL. That's it. Now I could run the same command as before, but just to show you something different this time, I will use the nimiboost extension, VS Code extension, like Hugo, that allows me to, just by clicking here or pressing Ctrl K release V, to visualize my HTML directly in VS Code. That's very nice. And now, with this image, you will be able to see where the URL leads you. So, that's it for this very short introduction to Nimib, less than 5 minutes. And this shows you how to create a document with NimCode, showing if then I can set up a GitHub repo with pages on, and everyone will be able to see that I'm having fun with QR codes, and that Nim is awesome, and it's gonna rule them all. So here we are at the main content of this presentation. We will present the latest release of Nimib 0.3 Blockmaker. It is called Blockmaker because the first point is the fact that a major refactoring allows you now to create your own blocks. And Hugo will talk about some very nice blocks that allow you to put interactivity only using NimCode. But those are not the only two highlights. In particular, in 0.3, we added as default the code as in source. And
after telling you how to create your own blocks, I will give you some examples of some fancy blocks. Then I will pass the microphone to Hugo, who will talk also about a block called NBPython. And I will take it back at the end of the interactive presentation to show you an example of a complex application that shows interactivity. There is a lot more stuff in these releases. The release notes are very detailed, so I refer you to that. Code as in source, what do we mean by that? Before 0.3, the default was you have some code in the source file, and when this is shown in the HTML, it appears like this, which is a bit odd. What is happening here? Some indentation has been added, some indentation has been removed. A comment has been removed, while the documentation comment stays. Another weird implementation, and oh, here we are actually losing information. Why was that? Because the rendering of the code was done using a macro, a very simple macro, which is actually something that allowed the early development of Nimib, that renders the code from the abstract syntax tree. This is something that is still available with a compile time option. It was, but we now have a better option. Now there is code as in source. This is, by the way, also great work by Hugo, in which if you have the source, what you show in HTML is exactly as the source, because it's actually reading the source. This is what you expect, what we want, so it was not easy to put it as default because there were a few bugs. The implementation is not so straightforward, and also it changes, since it doesn't compose really well code blocks using this, it changed a little bit also some of the implementation of the blocks. But we are very happy about this. So, how do you make your own block? First, what do we mean by blocks? In Nimib, the first command will create a container of blocks, which is called an nbdoc object. And then the other commands, like nbtext, nbcode, or nbimage, adds blocks to the block container. And only at the end, these blocks are processed and rendered, and then they are put inside the theme, and the file is saved, and the HTML is produced. So, a block is data that is collected when the block is created. Optionally, some processing of this data. For example, you might need to convert the markdown to HTML. And finally, a rendering, in which you apply templates to data. Templates is an overloaded word in Nim, of course. Note that in Nimib there are more than one backend. There is one more, Markdown backend, and we plan to put more, and in particular the next big change in Nimib is planned to be a backend maker release, which will simplify making backends. But today we will focus only on the HTML backend. So, what is the type of NB block? There is the data part, in which we have some special strings for putting the code source or the output of a code block, which is also used for the text of an nbtext block. And then there is a context object, which is a generic container of data. You can think of that as a JSON node. And in fact, in the future, it might actually become a real JSON node. Then there is the process part, which is a sort of a contrived way in which, using as key the name of the command, we allow to have a sequence of different procedures, in which we refer by name, and this procedure will modify the context of the block and the container, adding more data. And finally, there is the rendering part, in which we have in the document defined many partials indexed by the name of the command, nbcode, nbtext, and these are mustache template. And now I will tell you a little bit more about what mustache is. Mustache is the template library that Nimib uses. And at the moment, you have to use that. In the future, we'll see. So, in Mustache, the templates are usually called partials because usually they are part of a bigger template. And here we see a trimmed down version of the partials of Nimib. You will have an HTML document with a head part and with a body part. And inside the head, you have something which is called head. Inside the body, which you have something that is called main. And the two mustache sign with the greater sign is the syntax for another partial. The head partial, in this case, is something that will add the title if I added a T data to the title. And the main title will have two parts. One, which will be unescaped data, the HTML part, and one code, which will automatically escape data. So if the data is T is high, HTML is a piece of HTML code, and code is something else, and I render the doc partial with this data, with this context, the results is that I see the title inside head, I see the HTML high inside the body, and if you notice, the code has a less sign, which is escaped with end LT and the comma, the semicolon. And this is something that is done in order to be able to show, I don't know, you can show HTML in the HTML document without having it interpreted as HTML. So the escaping is an important part. So now let's see how the different basic blocks of Nimib are implemented, and this will give you an idea of how to implement your own block. So nbtext, we have a template which is called new nb slim block. We give it the name of the block, and basically what we do is take the text and add it to the output field of the current block. This block will need a processing. In particular, we will convert the markdown text to HTML, and there will be a procedure called nboutput.html, which adds another set of data to the context output to HTML. So then, when we render, the final rendering is the unescaped version of the HTML. Note that the command is called slim block because the text block does not save code source. This is a breaking change with respect to 0.2, and we provided another block if you want to show the block of the text block. The NB code is something in which you create a NB code block. In this case, not only it creates the block, but it saves the source, taking it from the body. And then the code block executes the body and captures the standard output and saves it into NB block output. We also have some processing in this code block, which is highlighting the code. Since it can be statically done, we do it. And then the rendering is a little bit more complex because you have the source of the code and the output of the code. So the main partial is working with two other partial, nbcode source and nbcode output, and nbcode output will only be shown if there is actual output. Note that here the command is different. Now we're calling a new NB code block. NB image is simpler. It's a slim block in which the data is URL and the caption. And the rendering is putting this URL and caption, wrapping it into image, figure, and figure caption. So these are the basic blocks. In Nimib there are other blocks. In particular, I mentioned the NB coding block. When you do not want to inject your variables in the global scope, you can have two NB code block in the sequence that redeclare the same variable X. I already mentioned the NB text with code, which is an NB text which saves the code source. Then there are two versions of NB file, one in which the input is a string and one in which the input is nim code and it will write a file with the nim code. And finally, I want to mention the raw HTML, which is a very versatile block that just outputs raw HTML. So how can you create blocks? Well, one way to do it sort of natively, using these templates, which are new NB code block, new NB slim block. You should use the first one if you need to use the source of the block. Otherwise, you use the second one. Slim is a block without body. Or you can do it in more creative ways. In particular, you can copy and customize your blocks. For example, if I want to create a block that will output 3 spans of 3 different colors, so it will output actually HTML, what do? I use the NB code block, I change the name of the block to NB code HTML output. This is how I decided to call this template. Then I customize the partial, but only the code output part. Instead of referring to the partial of NB code output, I will use the unescaped output of the code. And then if I call it like that, in which each line of the echo creates a real span, then this code block will produce the 3 spans that you see below. The other way, classical way, is to compose other blocks. In particular, for example, if I want to repeat multiple times the same text, it's very easy to do with a code block like this. But there are more interesting and creative ways of composing other blocks. One particular powerful element is the NB raw HTML. For example, I can create a details summary block by using raw HTML before a body and after the body to open and close the HTML tags. And this will create a detail and summary block on which I can click. Note that in this block, we can have multiple blocks inside. And in fact, this type of approach is what Nimi Slides use it for the slide template, but it is limited to the HTML backend and cannot be customized. So in the future, there will be a container block, which will be a better solution for this. Okay, so now a few examples of some fancy blocks, by which I mean blocks which use external JavaScript functionalities. All these examples are taken from nblog, which is a blog about Nimib and Nim, which is sort of still in a draft mode. But it's where I experiment on doing stuff with Nimib. Before seeing the examples, when we add additional JavaScript functionalities, usually we need to add, a style sheet to the head part of HTML, or maybe we need to run a script at the end of the body, and this is how we do it. So the first example is a before-after image slider, which looks like this. 2 images on which I can slide from one into the other. And to implement this, I add I'm using a library which is called Juxtapose, and they tell me add this style sheet, add this script at the end of the body, and then every time you want to show 2 images side by side with a slider, you create this class. And this, I add the partial to the document, and this I call it only once, use Juxtapose, and then every time I want to create a slider, I call the NB Juxtapose with 2 different URL. As another example, for example, I can show you how to do diagrams like this using the library mermaid.js. Again, I'm reading a little bit of documentation and understand that I need to add the script to the head and also a style sheet. Then I need to initialize the library at the end of the body, and then the diagram will be a class mermaid with the specs. And every time I want to add a diagram, I will add an NB diagram block in which I'll add the specs data. As a final example, I will show you how to embed plotly plots in Nimib. This is something that it will end up in Nimib. It is a little bit more involved how to understand how to do that. I had to go through the plotly source code, but the idea at the end is still the same. Add something to the head, add a partial for when I will call the nbplotly template, in which I will add a div with a specific ID, and I will call the plotly JavaScript with that ID, with some data and some layout. And the nbplotly is something that will take an identifier for the plot and some body. The body is where I will define the plot, and the identifier will be used to create the data part and the layout part of the proc. In particular, something else that we added to Nimib is a way to receive an incremental integer ID that increases every time, and in this way we can add multiple blocks of the same type with different IDs. And if I use this template, I can embed a plot in Nimib, and the code to do that is calling nbplotly with an identifier of the plot, which is the plot that I have produced after having called some of the plotly code. So now I will pass it back to Hugo.
Thank you, Pietro. And now let's look at one of these custom blocks that you can make with this new API in Nimib 0.3, and it's NBPython. And it allows you to run Python code in your document using NimPy. And you use it by passing the Python code as a string to NBPython. And ideally, it should also capture all the outputs from the Python code, but at the moment it's not working on Linux at least, but it has worked on Windows in the past, so it's something we're working on. And here is a more complex example using matplotlib and NumPy, where we create the plot and then save it to a file, and then we can view this here. And something to remember is that this is run every time the document is created and not just once. So if you update the code, for example, if we change this to cosine instead, then we will get the cosine plot here. And now to the main attraction of the event. Nimib goes interactive. So now you can create interactive elements in Nimib just using nim. Previously, this was possible using JavaScript, but it's more error prone and not as nice as writing nim code, of course. So, but why do we want interactivity in a document? The first reason is engaging content. You don't want your readers to fall asleep while reading your article, so better give them something to do while reading it. And having something, especially if the subject you have lends itself very well to interactivity, it's really nice to have something that the readers will remember. And the second reason is that it's very comfortable to use nim for everything, especially if you want to pass something from the document to the JavaScript. Then it's a pain to do without this. And then it has the advantage that it runs locally. Everything is contained inside an HTML file, all the JavaScript is inlined, so you don't need any server or anything to run it. You just open the HTML file and it works. And of course, it's fun. That's the most important thing. Even if we didn't have all the others, interactivity is fun. So how does it work? As you may know, Nim has many backends and can compile to C, C++, Objective-C, but also to JavaScript. And that's something we are using very much here. And what's basically happening is that when you pass a block of code to be compiled to JavaScript, it will copy-paste the code to a file, compile the file, and the generated JavaScript is then inlined into the final HTML document. And something else that's very important is capturing variables. So if we have a variable in our document and we want to use it in the interactive part, we have to do some magic to make it happen, which I will explain later. But let's start off with the API. And the two main functions that we'll use is nbjs from code. Everything you give to it, it will compile to JavaScript basically. And then if you want to use Carex, front-end library written in Nim, you can use mbcarex code, which is just some sugar on top of nbjs from code, specifically for Carex. So let's look at an example now. And the result that we will get is this button we can click, and then it will count it for us. And let's look at the code and how it works. So we start off with nbraw HTML, which will inline HTML for us. And the HTML that we want is a paragraph with some placeholder text, and then an ID, so we can reference it later, and a button that says click me, and it has also an ID. And then the exciting part begins. Everything inside of nbjs from code will be compiled to JavaScript, and it will know nothing about the rest of the document by default. So we start off by importing the DOM module from the standard library, and we get the two elements by ID. We initialize a counter as an int, and then we add an event listener to the button that when we click it, it will increment the counter, and it will set the paragraph's text to you have clicked counter times. And it works. So now let's talk about capturing variables. And in this example, we have a variable name and a variable food. But imagine this is something much more complex. For example, something you have read from a file or something that you can't do in JavaScript. And now we want to be able to use these two variables inside of the JavaScript. And the first thing we do is we inline some HTML, a paragraph and a button again with IDs. And then here we have the secret sauce. We must specify that we want to use name and food inside of this nbjs from code. And what it will do is basically, because we'll just copy paste this, we must somehow embed the value of the variables inside of the file that we will create. So we serialize the values of name and food into JSON, and then inside of the code we will create assignments for a variable named food and a variable named name. And we will set them to the function call that deserializes them of the serialized string. And it works amazingly. And we do basically the same as in the previous example. We import DOM and get the elements by ID. And then we create an event listener for the button. And when we click it, it will set the paragraph's text to name's favorite food is food. And in this case, it should say Hugo's favorite food is hot dogs. Let's see if it works. It works. Amazing. And remember, these two came from the C code and not the JavaScript code initially. And doing this without the ability to capture the code or capture the variables would have been quite a bit of work to get it working, especially if name and food wouldn't have been just strings or another simple type, but an object or even a ref object. Then this is really convenient. And now we have an example of using Carex with MVJs from code. And it needs a bit of boilerplate to work, because each component will have its own Carex instance. So we have to create a unique root div for every one of them. So we create an ID, and we create the div, and then we import Carex, and then we do some usual Carex stuff. We create a createDOM function with a build HTML, some content, and then we set renderer, and it will start the Carex runtime. But something we can notice here is that all of the code that's highlighted right now is something that you will write for every component that you make. So why not simplify this for the user so that they don't have to write all this, and instead only have to write what's really different each time, namely this code. And that's what NBCarex code does for us. And here we have the same example as before. A button that we can click, and it counts how many times we've clicked it. And NBCarex code has the same job as NBJs from code. So everything inside of it will be compiled to JavaScript. And here we can initialize any variables that we want to use. And here we have Carex HTML. And it's the thing that simplifies the most for us, because what we will pass inside Carex HTML is what we would have passed into build HTML up here. So this goes into Carex HTML instead. And we create a paragraph with a text you have clicked counter times. And each time the variable counter is updated, it will automatically update the text. And then we create a button that says click me, and every time we click on it, it increments the counter. And yeah. And the last part of the interactivity is post-render. So the way Carex works is that you give it the ID of a div, but the div is empty in the raw HTML file. But Carex will dynamically create elements inside of it once it has started. So this means that if you try to access an element that you create in Carex before Carex has been properly initialized, the element won't have been dynamically created yet, and you will just get nil as a result. So we need some way to run a piece of code after Carex has been initialized in these cases. And that's what post render does for us. And in this example, we create a canvas with a black background and a blue dot. Or blue circle, rather. And the way it works is we do MB Carex code, we import a few libraries that we will use. Inside Carex HTML, we create a canvas element with the ID canvas ID. And then here we have post render. And it's important that post render comes before Carex HTML, because in Carex HTML, that's where Carex is started. So it won't proceed any further down than that. And now, when we are inside post render, we know that Carex has been properly initialized, and we can safely get the element by ID, the canvas in this case. And if we wouldn't have used post render, then we would have run this code before the element was created at first, and we would just have got a nil and a lot of errors when trying to use it. And then we have some code to draw the canvas, but that's not the important part here. And then we draw the blue circle at a random place, and yeah, this is basically it for the interactive part.
Thank you, Hugo. So, now I want to show you a method plant app, which is an example of a more complex NB Carex app based on a plot function based itself on JS Canvas from Planetis. And I will show you, in particular, an API for Carex widgets, which avoids boilerplate when building some widgets. The app looks like this. There is here a green plant, like a fern, some controls, and some math. Because indeed, this plant is the plot of a parametric curve driven by some equations. And these equations in turn depend on some parameters. And these parameters can be controlled here in the app. Not going particular in details on what these parameters do and why they are named like that, just as a backstory, this app reproduces exactly a Shiny Live app by Nick Stryer, which in turn was an original work based on a single snapshot of this plant with the same equations, but with frozen parameters, basically. Nick Stryer invented, I think, the names of these parameters. And what is interesting here is the fact that he's showing this app with Shiny Live, which is a framework derived from Shiny in R that is being built in Python and that actually works inside the browser. And if you compare the experience of this framework, you will see that in order to see this app, you will need to load Python in the browser, and the overall interactivity experience is a little bit more clunky. So this is for me to say that this kind of interactivity that Nim offers, I think it has great promise. It would be really interesting for data scientists that they are kind of loving this fact of being able to produce in a simple way interactive apps in the browser. We do miss a little bit of the ecosystem. And as a final thing, I want to show you the source, because I think that the source is the simplest that you can get to implement the logic. You're using nimib, you're using useLatex, which is the functionality that is present since 0.1 to show LaTeX math derived from LaTeX. And then we are importing Carex widgets. and we are creating 4 input sliders. 3 of them are int input sliders, 1 of them is a float. Leafiness, order, waviness, and simplicity, and we decide for each one of them different min-max values and a different default value. Then, of course, we will need the logic for deriving the curve of the plant, the x and y, and we will use a plot function that is taken from this JS plot, which basically wraps some functionality from JS Canvas. And we are using here the post-render function of NB-Carex, because every time we interact with one of the sliders, we will need to recreate the plant and plot it again. And the HTML part is very simple. There is a canvas element and 4 sliders. And these 4 functions, they are created by these Carex widgets, which uses the name of creates the variable and creates a template that can be used inside the Carex HTML to produce the widget. Then there is the math, and then there is the rest of the document, and that's it. Very simple, and I think I'm really excited about this development, and I'm really happy about it. I hope you're too.
Now let's move on to nimiboost, which is a Nimib extension for VS Codium and VS Code. And it has 2 main features: syntax highlighting of code in strings, and the 2 most prevalent examples is in NB text we write our text in Markdown, but if it's just an ordinary string literal, we can't really highlight it, and it's hard to see exactly what's going on and if we are doing any errors. So if we mark the string as a markdown string, nimiboost will allow us to highlight it as if it was markdown, which is really cool. And we can also do it for HTML, Python, and also Nim code in a string. And the second thing is that it allows us to preview the Nimib document inside the editor, so we don't have to use a browser to preview it, which can be really nice when you want to iterate on the design of the document and just want to quickly look at what it looks like. So let's head over to VS Codium. Welcome to this walkthrough of nimiboost, the Nimib extension for VS Codium and VS Code. And we can start off by looking at this document. It's a quite ordinary Nimib document. We have an NB text with some markdown in a string, an NB Python with some Python code in a string, an NB raw HTML with some HTML code in a string, and NBJS from string with some Nim code in a string. All of them are quite hard to read, in my opinion, because you don't get the highlighting, so it's hard to know if you have done something wrong somewhere. And this is the first thing that nimiboost does for you. But let's first install it. We go to extensions and search for nimiboost, and we get this here. We can install it, and in the README here you have a bit of information. So the first thing nimiboost does is syntax highlighting of strings. You do that by adding HL, which stands for highlight, and then the language, MD for markdown. So highlight markdown. And voila, we have highlighted the markdown. Our headers are highlighted, the italic text is italic, the bold text is bold, and the crossed over text is crossed over. And as an example of why this can be useful is if we remove one of these, we'd see that it's not crossed over anymore, so we know that there's an error. And when we add it back in, we can see that it's crossed over once again. And then we have lists, which are also highlighted. And for the Python code, we have HLPy highlight Python, and we can see that the code looks as if we just had ordinary Python code. And here we have my personal favorite, HL_HTML. And I think this makes a huge difference when adding HTML as strings. And one of the greatest pros, in my opinion, is that it can help you spot wrong string signs. Because if we don't have this, it's way harder to know where each string starts and where each string ends. So here it wouldn't be obvious that this is wrong, if we didn't know that it was wrong, of course. But if we add this back in, we can see that it's highlighted red because it's out of place. And lastly, we have a nim. So HL_nim, and we can see that the code is now highlighted as nim code. Pretty neat. And as you might have seen, there also are variants which end with F. And these are equivalent of string interpolation. So if I do mdf and add a variable, for example, hot dogs, then I can add it in here, and it will get inserted. And now on to the second feature of NimibBoost, namely the preview window inside the editor. And if you open the command palette with Ctrl-Shift-P, you have this command, nimib preview, which you can also run by doing Ctrl-K, lift your hands, V. And if we run it, you can see that it says NimibBoost compiling down here. And then we'll get a preview of the document. We can see that the headers, italic, bold, and crossed over text, and the lists are as we expect. And we have also added in the hot dog string here. And you can interact with this as you would usual Nimib documents. So this is really handy when you want to iterate on a document and get quick feedback. And as you might have noticed, we now have the NimibBoost symbol down here. And this appeared because we ran the Nimib preview for the first time. And it will also appear automatically if you have a nimib.toml file in your directory. And clicking this will just run the preview.
So, roadmap. What lies ahead for the future of Ninip? There are some priorities, and number one is to produce stuff with NIB 0.3. Because this is Nimib original goal, to share more Nim code. In particular, we have in mind to try and work on more sign-in getting starting tutorials, and of course doing advent of code in Nimib, or at least in Nim. You should too. But we have already thoughts about what would be the target for, let's say, the next big change, which would be to concentrate on refactoring the backend stuff in order to be able to create more backends. This is something that is right now not so straightforward. And of course, there are always side projects, too many of them, but one which I cannot postpone too much anymore is to build a blog theme Jekyll clone, in order also to give nblog a proper blog appearance. And this is something I plan to work with as a next thing, basically. But there is a lot of incremental changes that we can add to the 0.3, and you can help us with that. One thing that comes to mind, add more blocks. The release is called Block Maker, so that you can make more blocks. For example, an MB shell block in order to run a command in the shell, capture the output, and visualize it. Or, as I mentioned, a container block that allows you to create a block that contains other nimib blocks inside. For example, nimib slides would benefit from that, but also a detailed summary block would be nice. Then we should actually improve the defaulting. Many things can be done there. One particular that is already an issue in the Nimib repo is to improve how the code output appears. We should add a table of contents for the content inside a single document. In particular, something that we are sorely missing are anchors of headers. So even if you want to link to the comment of a Nimib document, we do not have the anchors yet. This is something that we should add. But also, when you have more than one document, you want to have a site index that indexes all the documents. And this is kind of a separate thing. And also, it requires some shared data between the document. So some place where you have this index or some way to produce it. So that's why also the API is not still completely clear for this. And one thing that it's bothering me since one of the first examples of Nimib, which was Penguin examples in which we explore a data set with ggplot and Datamancer, is the fact that we show the data frame as a text and not as an HTML table. And this is something that should be doable. But there are many, many other things. You can look in the issue in the repo. You can open new issues. We probably should catalog them better. Then we can dream of further things down the road. In particular, once we have the backend maker, we should make other backends like the LaTeX backend, a Twitter backend. Why not?
Twitter? How would that work?
Yeah, okay. So Twitter backend would be something like you have your document, you encapsulate some stuff that you want to tweet, and it prepares you a Twitter thread with images for code blocks and images for image output. It would be really cool.
Ooh.
It's not so easy, probably, but that would be a nice thing for me to try and do that.
Absolutely.
Then something else that could be the next major change would be to have an API to not only provide the front end, but also the back end of a full app. Not only the interactivity in the client, but interactivity with a server. One inspiration for me for this is Streamlit. Actually, in part, Nimib API is inspired by working with the Streamlit, which is the Python libraries. And then we will have to put a backend, could be a standard Jester backend, and maybe for interaction between client and server, we use HTMX. Who knows? This is still all in the air, but it's nice to think about that. One thing I would like to do sooner or later is to try and build the full documentation, build actually the full library from Nimib documents. There is a framework called NBDev in Python, which is something in which you write a Jupyter notebook, and from that you actually create the source files from the library, you create a full documentation, you have the tests inside. It's a very nice way to develop something. So I think it's in the reach of Nimib. And then sooner or later, there will also be at some point an executable called Nimib that will be used maybe for scaffolding, like creating initializing new projects and stuff. And there are many use cases, but for the moment, not a single one of them screamed for make an executable. So it's not there yet. And once we have the possibility of serving apps, we could think of making a Jupyter-like apps, which opens a web service in which you can actually edit cells of text and code directly in the browser and rerun from a button in the browser. It would be very cool, I think. We can dream. And the thing is, you can help us dream and achieve this, this stuff by contributing to Ninip. Indeed, in this release, there has been quite some effort in improving the developer experience, which was not particularly great at the beginning, so probably that's why it was not so hard to improve it. Something that we did is that documentation of Nimib is built in the CI. Before, you had to commit the HTML every time you made the change. And in particular, something very nice is that we added the deploy preview. So when you open a pull request, the docs will already built inside the pull request, and you have a way to see the docs and the changes. So be sure that you are not breaking too much stuff. We added some tests. We had in Nimib something called p-test that was a document with the tests that was a bit awkward to use. Now there are standard tests so that we can at least be a little bit more confident that we are not breaking stuff. And when you contribute, you should add possibly a test if it makes sense. Not everything in Nimib makes sense to have tests. We updated the docs and added a separate changelog with some Nimib history. And finally, we have a new contribute MD, which I'm not spoiling, because we have not yet written it at the time of recording. The deploy preview, where do you find it? When you open a pull request, there are a number of checks, and there is one called Netlify preview. And in the details link, if you click here, it will open the deploy preview, the documents with your change. And one last thing that we have planned for now on is to keep going Nimib speaking hours. Because me and Hugo have been meeting regularly to produce these slides. You might not see it, but a lot of work went into these slides. And the idea is to keep up this probably once a month and open it to everyone who wants to use Nimib or contribute to Nimib. So you can pop in the meeting and say hi and ask us stuff or tell us stuff. And you don't need to pop in these meetings to contribute anyway. We will announce this somewhere, probably in Nimib discussions. This is, by the way, inspired by a post and tweets by Simon Williamson, who spoke about running office hours for open source project. So I think that's all, right?
Yes, I think so.
So thank you for listening. Grazie.
Tack så mycket. Have a great day.
Bye.